For decades, Mitch McConnell was one of the most recognizable and powerful figures in Washington. He survived bitter elections, partisan wars, presidential battles, and countless attempts by his political opponents to push him aside. Yet in the summer of 2026, the 84-year-old Kentucky senator suddenly faced an opponent no political strategy could defeat: the growing fragility of his own body. And then, almost without warning, Mitch McConnell disappeared from public view. On June 14, 2026, McConnell was admitted to a hospital in the Washington area. At first, his office revealed remarkably little. His spokesman confirmed only that the senator had been hospitalized and was receiving care, without explaining why he had been taken there or how serious his condition might be. For a man who had spent more than 4 decades under the relentless spotlight of American politics, the silence immediately felt unusual. Days passed. Then weeks. McConnell did not appear before television cameras. He did not walk through the halls of the Capitol. There was no press conference explaining what had happened. Washington continued moving around him, but one of its longest-serving political figures was suddenly nowhere to be seen. The absence became impossible to ignore. By early July, Reuters reported that McConnell had been away since mid-June, while his office had still not publicly disclosed the reason for his hospitalization. The timing made the uncertainty even more striking. The Senate was preparing to return for another work period, yet McConnell, a senator who still held important committee responsibilities, remained absent. And when information disappears, rumors usually rush in to fill the vacuum. Social media began producing increasingly dramatic claims about McConnell's condition. Some posts suggested that he was catastrophically ill. Others went much further, circulating unsupported claims that he had died or was completely incapacitated. None of those extreme claims had credible evidence behind them. But the speculation exposed a much larger question. What had actually happened to Mitch McConnell? Nearly a month after his hospitalization, the senator finally provided the public with an answer. On July 12th, McConnell revealed that he had suffered a fall in mid-June. According to his account, he briefly lost consciousness and was transported to the hospital. During his hospitalization, he also developed a mild case of pneumonia and received antibiotic treatment. Doctors performed extensive testing. McConnell later said the examinations did not reveal broken bones, a heart attack, a stroke, or several other serious conditions that people might have feared after such an incident. Yet the fall was serious enough to begin a lengthy recovery process. Instead of returning home immediately, McConnell entered a rehabilitation facility. His medical team focused on physical therapy and strategies intended to reduce the possibility of another fall. McConnell acknowledged that his recovery was moving more slowly than he wanted. For someone whose public image had always been built around endurance and control, admitting vulnerability appeared deeply uncomfortable. McConnell even addressed that discomfort himself. He explained that people of his generation often hesitate to discuss the vulnerability that accompanies aging. Even after spending most of his adult life in public, that instinct apparently remained with him. Those words changed the emotional tone of the story. This was no longer simply about another Washington politician missing votes. It was about an aging man confronting limits that power could not erase. McConnell's physical difficulties did not begin in 2026. He battled polio as a child, an illness that left lasting effects on his mobility. In recent years, falls and health incidents had become increasingly visible parts of his public life. Now, at 84, those old vulnerabilities appeared to be colliding with age. His rehabilitation stretched on. On July 27th, McConnell's office announced that he still had not been medically cleared to leave the rehabilitation facility and return to work. He was undergoing multiple physical therapy sessions each day, attempting to rebuild strength while also learning ways to reduce the risk of future falls. The consequence was personally significant. McConnell would miss Kentucky's famous Fancy Farm political gathering, an event he had attended for more than 4 decades. For a politician whose identity had been inseparable from Kentucky politics, that absence carried symbolic weight. Then, on August 6th, Almost 8 weeks after the original hospitalization, McConnell announced that he had finally been discharged from rehabilitation. But he was not returning to Capitol Hill. He would continue recovering at home. As of mid-August, McConnell still had not returned to public life in the way Americans had known him for decades. His staff maintained that he remained engaged with Senate business, and political allies said they had communicated with him. Yet questions surrounding his health, his ability to return, and the extraordinary silence around his recovery continued. The contrast is difficult to miss. For years, Mitch McConnell could influence judges, legislation, elections, presidents, and the direction of the Republican Party. But at 84, the most important battle of his life was no longer happening on the Senate floor. It was happening behind closed doors, through rehabilitation sessions, cautious steps, and the slow effort to regain strength. And to understand why this moment is so significant, we have to go much further back, to a childhood illness that nearly changed Mitch McConnell's life before his political career had even begun. Long before Mitch McConnell became one of the most powerful figures in Washington, his life was shaped by a battle that had nothing to do with elections, Senate rules, or political strategy. It began when he was still a child. In 1944, when McConnell was only 2 years old, he contracted polio. At the time, polio terrified families across the United States. Vaccines had not yet become widely available, and the disease could attack the nervous system, leaving children with permanent weakness, paralysis, or worse. For McConnell's family, the diagnosis meant confronting the possibility that their young son might never walk normally. The effects were especially severe in his left leg. According to McConnell's own accounts over the years, his mother, Julia, became central to his recovery. Determined to give her son every possible chance at mobility, she took him through an exhausting rehabilitation process that involved repeated exercises intended to strengthen the weakened muscles. This was not a short recovery. It was a daily struggle. McConnell has described how his mother followed doctor's instructions carefully, making sure that he performed the movements necessary to regain strength. The treatment required patience from both mother and child. There were no shortcuts and no guarantees. Eventually, McConnell recovered enough to walk without the kind of major disability his family had feared. But polio never completely disappeared from his life. The illness left lasting weakness in his left leg, something that would remain visible decades later as he moved through the halls of Congress. In many ways, the childhood experience became part of the mythology surrounding McConnell's personality. Supporters saw it as evidence of resilience. Critics often described him as unusually stubborn, calculating, and unwilling to surrender ground. Whatever one's political opinion of him, those characteristics would later become unmistakable features of his career. He learned very early that progress could be painfully slow. You could fall behind. You could struggle physically, but you kept moving. That philosophy would eventually become remarkably useful in Washington. McConnell was never known as the most charismatic politician in America. He was not famous for fiery speeches or commanding television performances. Instead, his power came from patience, procedural knowledge, discipline, and an ability to wait longer than many of his opponents. Those qualities would help him survive political battles that destroyed other careers. But they may also explain something more personal about his later years. For someone who had spent almost his entire life pushing through physical limitations, admitting that the body could no longer cooperate may have been especially difficult. That tension became increasingly visible as McConnell aged. Even during his years at the height of Senate power, his physical movements sometimes reflected the lingering consequences of childhood polio. He occasionally used railings or assistance on stairs, and people familiar with his history understood that mobility had never been effortless. Yet McConnell rarely built his political identity around physical hardship. He wanted to be judged as a politician, not treated as a symbol of disability. That attitude makes the events of his 80s particularly significant. When falls became more frequent, the issue was no longer simply an old childhood condition. Age was now interacting with physical vulnerabilities that had existed for decades. And unlike the 2-year-old child whose mother could spend hours guiding him through exercises, the 84-year-old senator was now recovering under the attention of an entire country. Every missing appearance attracted speculation. Every photograph was examined. Every stumble became political news. Every period of silence produced questions about whether he was still capable of doing his job. For McConnell, this must have represented a strange reversal. As a young child, his physical struggle happened largely inside his family. As an elderly senator, it happened under a national spotlight. And the contrast is striking. The boy who once fought simply to strengthen a weakened leg would eventually become Senate Majority Leader, shaping the federal judiciary, negotiating with presidents, and influencing some of the most consequential political battles of modern American history. Few people could have predicted that future when he was undergoing polio treatment. But that early experience also offers important context for understanding why McConnell continued working deep into his 80s. Retirement may appear obvious from the outside. For someone whose life had been defined by enduring discomfort and refusing to stop, however, leaving may have felt very different. Perhaps that is why, even as concerns about his health intensified, McConnell repeatedly returned to work after earlier incidents. In March 2023, a fall at a Washington hotel resulted in a concussion and fractured rib. He spent time hospitalized and in rehabilitation before eventually returning to the Senate. Later that same year, Americans witnessed two unsettling moments when McConnell suddenly stopped speaking during public appearances and appeared unable to respond normally for several seconds. The images traveled quickly around the world. For many viewers, they represented the first unmistakable sign that something had changed. But McConnell continued. Then came further falls. More questions. More scrutiny. By 2025 and 2026, the story had become impossible to separate from a larger debate about age in American political leadership. Still, understanding Mitch McConnell only through his recent health problems misses something fundamental. This was a man who had already spent more than 80 years living with the consequences of an illness that nearly limited his future before he could even understand what politics was. He had learned persistence before he learned power. And eventually, persistence would carry him from a childhood struggle with polio all the way to the center of American government. But the journey from that vulnerable child to Washington power broker was anything but inevitable. Because before Mitch McConnell could dominate the Senate, he first had to discover how political power actually worked. And when he did, he would become one of the most effective and controversial operators Capitol Hill had ever seen. Mitch McConnell's journey from a child recovering from polio to one of the most powerful figures in American politics did not happen because he was the loudest person in the room. It happened because he understood something many politicians never fully master. Power is often built quietly. Long before television networks analyzed his every move, McConnell was studying how government worked from the inside. He was fascinated by institutions, procedure, and political strategy. He did not possess the natural showmanship of some of the Republican Party's biggest personalities, but he had patience. And patience would become his greatest weapon. After studying political science at the University of Louisville and later earning a law degree from the University of Kentucky, McConnell began moving steadily through the world of government and Republican politics. His early career included work on Capitol Hill and positions inside the federal government. He served as an intern and later worked for Senator Marlowe Cook of Kentucky. During the Ford administration, McConnell also served as a Deputy Assistant Attorney General. Those experiences gave him something more valuable than fame. They gave him an education in how Washington actually operated. McConnell learned that legislation was rarely about dramatic speeches alone. It was about timing, vote counting, committee assignments, personal relationships, and knowing exactly when to compromise and when to refuse. That understanding would define the rest of his career. In 1977, he was elected Judge Executive of Jefferson County, Kentucky, a major local government position centered around Louisville. It was there that McConnell began developing the political machinery that would eventually carry him to the United States Senate. But his breakthrough came in 1984. That year, McConnell challenged Democratic Senator Walter D. Huddleston in what initially appeared to be an extremely difficult race. McConnell was hardly a national political celebrity. Huddleston was an incumbent. Yet McConnell's campaign produced one of the most memorable political advertisements of the era. The ad featured bloodhounds supposedly searching for Huddleston, suggesting that the senator had been absent from important votes while giving paid speeches elsewhere. The message was simple, humorous, and devastatingly effective. McConnell won the election by a razor-thin margin. In January 1985, he entered the United States Senate. Few could have predicted what would happen next. McConnell did not arrive in Washington as an instant superstar. Instead, he climbed the Senate hierarchy gradually, building relationships and becoming increasingly influential inside the Republican caucus. His style was deliberate. He rarely appeared driven by the need to be loved by the public. He seemed far more interested in winning. Over time, colleagues learned that McConnell possessed an unusual understanding of Senate procedure. He knew where pressure could be applied, how long a battle could be delayed, and when the opposition might eventually break. This reputation only grew. By the early 2000s, McConnell had become one of the central figures in Senate Republican leadership. Then, in 2007, he became the Senate Republican leader. It was the beginning of an era. For the next 17 years, McConnell would lead Senate Republicans through the presidencies of George W. Bush, Barack Obama, Donald Trump, and Joe Biden. The political landscape changed dramatically during those years. McConnell remained. His supporters praised his strategic discipline. His critics accused him of deepening partisan obstruction. Both sides, however, generally agreed on one thing. He knew how to use power. One of the clearest examples came during Barack Obama's presidency. In 2016, Supreme Court Justice Antonin Scalia died, creating a vacancy during Obama's final year in office. Obama nominated federal Judge Merrick Garland. McConnell refused to allow the Senate to proceed with consideration of the nomination, arguing that voters should have a voice through the upcoming presidential election. The decision was enormously controversial. Democrats viewed it as an unprecedented power play. Republicans saw it as a strategic victory. Donald Trump won the presidency later that year, and the vacant seat ultimately went to Neil Gorsuch. It would not be McConnell's last major impact on the Supreme Court. During Trump's presidency, McConnell made confirming federal judges one of his highest priorities. Hundreds of judicial appointments moved through the Senate. 3 Supreme Court justices, Neil Gorsuch, Brett Kavanaugh, and Amy Coney Barrett, were confirmed during Trump's term. For conservatives, this became one of McConnell's greatest achievements. For liberals, it cemented his reputation as one of the most consequential and polarizing Senate leaders in modern history. But political victories came at a cost. McConnell increasingly became a symbol of everything his opponents hated about Washington. His approval ratings were often low. He became the target of protests, harsh criticism, and endless political attacks. Even within his own party, relationships became complicated. Donald Trump frequently attacked McConnell after the 2020 election, particularly after McConnell acknowledged Joe Biden's victory and later criticized Trump's actions surrounding January 6, 2021. Yet McConnell rarely responded with the same emotional intensity. That was never really his style. He preferred leverage to outrage. And despite criticism from both Democrats and Republicans, he continued exercising enormous influence. That influence made the physical changes of his later years even more striking. For decades, McConnell had built an image around control. He controlled votes. He controlled timing. He controlled legislative strategy. He could delay nominations, accelerate confirmations, and force opponents to negotiate on his terms. But slowly, another story was developing beneath the political one. The man who seemed able to survive every Washington battle was beginning to experience increasingly visible health problems. Falls became more frequent. His movements became more cautious. Then came moments when he suddenly froze in front of cameras, unable to continue speaking. For the first time, observers were no longer asking only what Mitch McConnell planned to do politically. They were asking whether something was happening to him physically. And soon, those warning signs would become impossible to ignore. By the time Mitch McConnell entered his 80s, the political battles that had defined his career were beginning to compete with something far more personal. His health was becoming part of the story. For years, McConnell had moved through Washington with the effects of childhood polio still visible in his gait. That history was well known. An occasional difficulty with stairs or uneven movement was not necessarily considered unusual. But beginning in 2023, a series of incidents dramatically changed public perception. The first major warning came in March of that year. McConnell attended a private dinner at a hotel in Washington, D.C. During the evening, he fell. The consequences were serious. He suffered a concussion and fractured a rib. For an 81-year-old man with an existing history of mobility problems, the incident was more than a minor accident. McConnell was hospitalized and later moved into inpatient rehabilitation. Suddenly, the Senate Republican leader was gone from Capitol Hill. His absence lasted for weeks. When he finally returned, the message from McConnell and his team was one of determination. He was back. He was working. He had no intention of allowing one fall to dictate the end of his political career. But only a few months later, Americans witnessed something even more unsettling. On July 26, 2023, McConnell was speaking during his regular Senate leadership press conference. Everything initially appeared normal. Then, without warning, he stopped. McConnell stood silently in front of the microphones. His eyes remained open, but he did not continue speaking. For roughly 20 seconds, the senator appeared frozen in place. His Republican colleagues moved closer. Senator John Barrasso, a physician, touched McConnell's arm and began speaking to him. McConnell was eventually escorted away from the podium. Minutes later, he returned and continued answering questions. His staff said he had felt lightheaded. But the footage had already spread across television networks and social media. Millions of Americans watched the same disturbing moment. And almost immediately, speculation began. Had McConnell suffered a stroke? Was it a seizure? Was there some neurological condition the public did not know about? Those questions were understandable, but the most dramatic explanations were not established by the available evidence. McConnell was later medically evaluated, and his office said doctors found no evidence that he had suffered a stroke or seizure. Still, the visual impression was difficult to erase. A man who had spent decades controlling some of the most complicated negotiations in American politics had suddenly appeared unable to speak. Then it happened again. On August 30th, 2023, McConnell appeared at an event in Covington, Kentucky. A reporter asked whether he planned to run for re-election in 2026. McConnell began to respond. Then he stopped. Again, he appeared frozen. An aide approached and repeated the question. McConnell remained silent for around half a minute before the event continued. For the second time in just over a month, the Senate Republican leader had experienced a highly visible episode in front of cameras. This time, concern intensified. Even some people who strongly disagreed with McConnell politically responded with discomfort rather than criticism. The issue had moved beyond ordinary partisan combat. Americans were watching an elderly public official experience moments that looked deeply vulnerable. The Capitol physician subsequently cleared McConnell to continue his schedule, saying that occasional lightheadedness during concussion recovery was not uncommon, and that dehydration could also contribute to such symptoms. But politically, something had changed. Every appearance was now watched differently. Every pause attracted attention. Every slow movement generated discussion. McConnell remained in office and continued performing his duties, but questions surrounding age and health followed him wherever he went. They were not happening in isolation. Across Washington, an increasingly intense debate was emerging about elderly political leaders. President Joe Biden's age was frequently discussed. Donald Trump's age also became part of political debate. Senator Dianne Feinstein's declining health before her death in 2023 had raised difficult questions about when public service should end. McConnell became another central figure in that conversation. How old is too old to hold enormous political power? And who gets to decide? The politician himself? Doctors? Voters? Colleagues? There are no simple answers. Age alone does not determine competence. Some people remain remarkably capable into their 80s. Others experience serious limitations much earlier. But McConnell's visible health incidents ensured that the question would no longer disappear. Then came additional falls. In December 2024, McConnell fell after a Senate Republican lunch, reportedly spraining his wrist and suffering a facial injury. In February 2025, he experienced further falls near the Senate chamber. Photographs and video showed aides assisting him, and on at least one occasion, he used a wheelchair afterward. His office emphasized that he remained able to perform his work. But to the public, the pattern was becoming increasingly difficult to dismiss. One incident could be accidental. Two could be unfortunate. Repeated falls across several years created a different impression. McConnell's body seemed to be demanding more caution than his political schedule allowed. Yet he continued. That persistence was entirely consistent with the man Americans had watched for decades. This was the child who had fought through polio. The politician who had survived close elections. The leader who had endured attacks from Democrats, Republicans, presidents, activists, and members of his own party. Walking away had never been McConnell's instinct. But eventually, even he acknowledged that one chapter had to close. In February 2025, on his 83rd birthday, McConnell announced that he would not seek another Senate term in 2026. After more than 4 decades representing Kentucky, his career in elected office was approaching its end. Still, retirement remained nearly 2 years away. And the health concerns did not stop. Then came the fall of June 2026. This time, McConnell did not quickly return to the Capitol. He disappeared from public view for weeks. And in that silence, something predictable happened. The internet began creating its own version of the story. Claims spread. Rumors multiplied. Some were exaggerated. Others were completely unsupported. And soon, the line between genuine concern and misinformation became dangerously blurred. To understand what really happened, we have to separate the facts from the rumors, because the truth was already dramatic enough. When Mitch McConnell disappeared from public view in the summer of 2026, concern quickly turned into speculation. For weeks, one of the most recognizable figures in American politics was absent from the Senate, absent from television, and largely absent from public life. His office initially released only limited information about his hospitalization. That vacuum created the perfect environment for rumors. And the internet filled it almost immediately. Some social media users claimed McConnell was far more seriously ill than his staff admitted. Others suggested he had lost the ability to communicate or perform his duties. A few posts went even further, circulating the completely unsupported claim that he had died. There was no credible evidence for those extreme claims. But once such stories begin spreading online, correcting them can be much harder than creating them. The real story was serious enough without exaggeration. McConnell had suffered a fall on June 14, 2026. According to the account he later released publicly, he briefly lost consciousness and was taken to the hospital. During his hospitalization, doctors performed extensive examinations. McConnell later said those tests did not reveal a stroke, heart attack, broken bones, or several other potentially catastrophic conditions. He was also treated for a mild case of pneumonia. After leaving the hospital, he did not immediately return home or to Capitol Hill. Instead, McConnell entered a rehabilitation facility where he underwent physical therapy designed both to strengthen his body and reduce the likelihood of another fall. Those facts painted a picture that was concerning but dramatically different from the darkest rumors circulating online. McConnell was alive. He was recovering. And according to his office, he remained involved in Senate-related work. Still, the limited public visibility continued fueling suspicion. Some people asked a reasonable question. If McConnell was well enough to work, why had the public seen so little of him? Others turned that legitimate question into something much more extreme. Photographs released during his recovery were analyzed relentlessly. People studied his appearance, posture, facial expression, and surroundings, sometimes attempting to make medical conclusions based on a single image. That is where genuine concern began crossing into speculation. A photograph cannot provide a neurological diagnosis. A political rumor cannot replace medical evidence. And an absence from television does not prove that someone is incapacitated. Yet the unusual circumstances ensured that rumors would continue. McConnell had spent decades as one of Washington's most powerful and polarizing politicians. That mattered. To his supporters, the speculation surrounding his health sometimes looked cruel. To his critics, the secrecy surrounding his condition appeared to raise legitimate questions about transparency. Both reactions reflected a deeper reality. McConnell was not simply an elderly private citizen recovering from a fall. He was a sitting United States senator. That meant his health had public consequences. Senators vote on legislation. They participate in committees. They represent millions of residents. When one is absent for an extended period, constituents naturally want to know whether that person can continue performing the responsibilities of office. Kentucky Governor Andy Beshear became one of the public figures pressing for greater clarity. Beshear argued that Kentuckians deserve more information about McConnell's condition and ability to continue serving. The debate therefore became much bigger than gossip. It became a question of accountability. How much medical privacy should an elected official have? And at what point does a serious health condition become something voters are entitled to understand? There is no universally accepted answer. Public officials remain human beings with a right to medical privacy. But they also occupy positions whose responsibilities cannot always be delegated indefinitely. McConnell's case exposed that tension in unusually dramatic fashion. The rumors themselves also revealed something about modern political culture. A generation earlier, an elderly senator might have disappeared from public view for several weeks and rumors would have spread through newspapers, radio programs, or word of mouth. In 2026, speculation can reach millions of people within hours. A misleading post can be copied thousands of times before anyone checks the original source. A dramatic headline often travels faster than a careful correction. And political polarization makes the problem worse. People are more likely to believe extraordinary claims when those claims reinforce what they already think about a politician. McConnell had spent years becoming a political symbol. To many conservatives, he was the strategist responsible for reshaping the federal judiciary. To many liberals, he represented ruthless partisan power. To Trump loyalists, he had at times become an establishment Republican enemy. Those competing identities meant that almost every new detail about his health could be interpreted through a political lens. But eventually, the most reliable evidence came from McConnell himself and those who had direct contact with him. He publicly explained the fall. His staff released updates about his rehabilitation. Colleagues said they had communicated with him. And in early August, McConnell announced that he had been discharged from the rehabilitation facility and would continue recovering at home. That did not eliminate every question. It did, however, contradict the most extreme rumors. The difference between those two realities is essential. It is fair to ask whether an 84-year-old senator recovering from repeated falls can fully carry out the demands of office. It is fair to ask why more information was not released earlier. It is fair to debate whether he should complete his term. But it is not responsible to transform unanswered questions into invented facts. And that distinction became even more important as McConnell's absence turned into a political issue. Because soon, the question was no longer simply, what happened to Mitch McConnell? It became something far more uncomfortable. Should he still be serving at all? And that question would force Kentucky and Washington to confront a debate that reaches far beyond one aging senator. By the summer of 2026, the debate surrounding Mitch McConnell had changed. It was no longer only about his health. It was about whether he could still fulfill the responsibilities of the office he had held for more than 4 decades. That distinction mattered. For years, McConnell's age had been discussed mostly as a political talking point. Critics joked about it. Supporters dismissed those attacks as partisan. His repeated falls and highly publicized freezing episodes made the subject more serious. But as long as McConnell returned to work, the argument remained largely theoretical. The events of June 2026 changed that. After his fall, hospitalization, pneumonia diagnosis, and transfer to rehabilitation, McConnell remained away from the Senate for an extended period. Votes continued without him. Committee work continued without him. Washington continued moving while one of Kentucky's 2 senators recovered outside the Capitol. That created an unavoidable question. At what point does a private medical problem become a public governing problem? Kentucky Governor Andy Beshear was among those demanding more transparency. Beshear argued that Kentuckians deserved to hear directly from McConnell and understand whether their senator remained capable of performing his duties. The criticism was politically complicated. Beshear is a Democrat. McConnell is a Republican. That naturally led some Republicans to dismiss the governor's comments as partisan opportunism. But the basic question could not be dismissed so easily. McConnell represented millions of people. Those voters were entitled to representation. And after weeks without a normal public appearance, uncertainty about his condition was growing. Beshear eventually went further, publicly suggesting that if McConnell could not demonstrate that he was capable of doing the job, resignation should be considered. That immediately intensified the controversy. To McConnell's allies, the demand looked premature and disrespectful. The senator was recovering from a documented medical event. Rehabilitation after a serious fall can take time, especially at 84. The fact that recovery was slow did not automatically mean that McConnell had become mentally or professionally incapable. His office repeatedly emphasized that he continued communicating with staff and colleagues. Supporters therefore argued that absence should not be confused with incapacity. They also pointed to an obvious reality. Members of Congress have experienced illnesses, surgeries, injuries, and extended recoveries throughout American history. A temporary medical absence does not automatically require resignation. But critics responded with another reality. McConnell's 2026 hospitalization was not an isolated incident. It came after the 2023 concussion, after the 2 freezing episodes, after the December 2024 fall, after additional falls in February 2025. Seen individually, each event could be explained. Seen together, they formed a pattern. And patterns matter when the person involved occupies one of the most demanding positions in government. The debate therefore became uncomfortable precisely because both sides had legitimate arguments. McConnell had a right to recover without strangers diagnosing him through social media. But constituents also had a right to ask whether their senator could physically return to the Capitol and participate consistently in the work they elected him to perform. The situation also exposed a broader weakness in American politics. There is no mandatory retirement age for members of Congress. A senator can continue serving as long as voters continue electing that person and constitutional requirements are satisfied. That means decisions about age are largely political rather than institutional. Voters decide. Candidates decide. Sometimes families, doctors, and colleagues quietly influence those decisions. But there is no automatic point at which an elderly senator is removed simply because of age. And age alone would be a poor standard. An 80-year-old can be perfectly capable. A much younger person can become seriously ill. The real issue is functional capacity. Can the person understand the legislation? Can the person participate in votes? Can the person communicate decisions? Can the person consistently represent constituents? Those were the questions increasingly surrounding McConnell. They were especially significant because he had already made one enormous decision about his future. In February 2025, McConnell announced that he would not seek another term in 2026. His extraordinary Senate career was already approaching its conclusion. For some observers, that made calls for his resignation unnecessary. Why force out a man who had already announced his departure? Why not allow him to finish the remaining months of his term with dignity? Others saw the same timeline differently. If McConnell was unable to regularly return to Washington, they argued, even several months mattered. Important votes could happen. National crises could emerge. Kentucky deserved 2 active senators throughout that period. Behind the constitutional and political arguments was a much more human story. For decades, McConnell had built his identity around staying. He stayed through political defeats. He stayed through unpopular approval ratings. He stayed when Democrats wanted him gone. He stayed when Donald Trump attacked him personally. He stayed after injuries. He stayed after the freezing episodes. Again and again, McConnell's instinct was endurance. But eventually, endurance itself can become complicated. There is a difference between refusing to quit because opponents demand it and recognizing when circumstances have fundamentally changed. Only McConnell, his doctors, his family, and the people closest to him could fully understand where that line stood in 2026. The public could see only fragments. A photograph. A written statement. A report from his office. An update from a colleague. That uncertainty made the final months of his career unlike almost anything that had come before. For most of his political life, Mitch McConnell controlled the timetable. He decided when to move, when to wait, when to force a vote, when to block one. But now the timetable was being controlled by something else. Recovery, age, and the limits of the human body. His Senate career was already moving toward its ending. The only question was what that ending would look like. Would Mitch McConnell return to the chamber one final time and leave on his own terms? Or had Americans already seen the last chapter of his public political life without realizing it? That uncertainty would define what came next. After more than 4 decades in the United States Senate, Mitch McConnell's political story is approaching its final chapter. But it is not ending the way most people once imagined. For much of his career, McConnell seemed almost inseparable from Capitol Hill. Presidents came and went. Republican factions rose and collapsed. Political scandals dominated headlines and disappeared. Yet McConnell remained, steadily accumulating influence and eventually becoming the longest-serving Senate party leader in American history. Now, at 84, the defining image is very different. Following his June 2026 fall, hospitalization, pneumonia, and lengthy rehabilitation, McConnell was discharged from the rehabilitation center on August 6th and continued recovering at home. He said he remained engaged with Senate business, communicating with staff and colleagues, but he did not immediately announce a confirmed date for returning to Capitol Hill. That uncertainty has transformed what should have been a relatively predictable retirement year into something far more complicated. McConnell had already announced in February 2025 that he would not seek re-election in 2026. His current Senate term expires on January 3, 2027. In other words, the ending was already scheduled. What nobody knew was whether his health would allow him to complete it in the way he intended. For McConnell, That distinction matters. This is a politician who spent most of his career mastering timing. He understood when to move legislation, when to delay, when to compromise, when to block, when to remain silent while everyone else reacted emotionally. But aging obeys no parliamentary procedure. Recovery cannot be forced through a vote. Physical strength cannot be negotiated behind closed doors. And for perhaps the first time in McConnell's long career, the timetable was not his to control. The symbolism is difficult to ignore. The same man who helped determine the ideological direction of the Supreme Court, shaped hundreds of federal judicial appointments, and negotiated with multiple presidents was now spending his days focused on physical therapy and fall prevention. That does not erase his political achievements, nor does it erase the controversies surrounding him. McConnell leaves behind a deeply divided legacy. Conservative supporters will remember him as one of the most effective Republican strategists of his generation. His role in reshaping the federal judiciary may influence American law for decades. His refusal to advance Merrick Garland's Supreme Court nomination in 2016 became one of the most consequential strategic decisions of his career. Later, during Donald Trump's first presidency, McConnell helped move 3 Supreme Court nominees through the Senate. To many Republicans, those victories alone secured his place in conservative political history. But Democrats often view the same events very differently. They accuse McConnell of intensifying partisan warfare, weaponizing Senate procedure, and applying institutional principles selectively whenever doing so helped his party. That contradiction is essential to understanding his legacy. McConnell was never universally admired. He was never trying to be. He wanted results. And for decades, he produced them. Yet none of those political arguments fully explains why his current condition has generated such intense emotional reactions. Part of the reason is simply that Americans are witnessing something familiar. A powerful person is aging. Whatever titles people possess, whatever institutions they control, eventually the body changes. Movements become slower. Recovery takes longer. Falls become more dangerous. Independence can become harder to maintain. McConnell's circumstances are unusual because they are happening under extraordinary public scrutiny, but the underlying reality is deeply ordinary. Perhaps that is why some people who strongly oppose his politics have still reacted to his health problems with sympathy. Political disagreement does not eliminate human vulnerability. At the same time, sympathy cannot replace legitimate questions about public responsibility. As of mid-August 2026, McConnell had been away from normal public Senate activity for roughly 2 months following his health crisis. His office said he remained engaged in work, and people who said they had spoken with him described him as mentally alert. But he still had not resumed the public schedule that once defined his life. Governor Andy Beshear continued demanding greater transparency, arguing that Kentuckians deserve clearer evidence regarding their senator's ability to serve. Those concerns should not automatically be interpreted as proof that McConnell is incapable. They are questions, and questions are different from conclusions. That distinction matters especially because social media has repeatedly turned uncertainty surrounding McConnell into unsupported claims. Nothing credible establishes the most extreme rumors about his condition. What is established is more restrained, but still significant. He suffered a serious fall. He briefly lost consciousness. He developed pneumonia. He spent weeks in rehabilitation. He returned home. And he continued physical therapy while hoping to resume his responsibilities. Whether he ultimately walks back into the Senate chamber before his term ends remains one of the unresolved elements of this story. But perhaps the larger ending has already begun. Mitch McConnell entered the Senate in January 1985. More than 40 years later, an extraordinary era in American politics is almost over. Friends will praise his discipline. Enemies will condemn his tactics. Historians will debate his influence. But behind all those arguments remains the story of a child who once fought polio, grew into one of Washington's most formidable political operators, and ultimately found himself confronting the same reality awaiting every human being. Time always wins eventually. And maybe that is what makes the final chapter of Mitch McConnell's career feel so different from everything that came before. For decades, Washington asked what Mitch McConnell would do next. Not what will he win. Not whom will he defeat. Not which judge will he confirm. But whether, after a lifetime built on persistence, Mitch McConnell will be able to return one final time and leave the Senate on his own terms.